I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, I guess we'll have a cozy chat today.
It'll be a cozy chat. I want to welcome everyone to today's guest speaker on public transit, the series. His name is Michael Seth Wexler, who was formerly with Copenhagenize, and I met Michael through a Copenhagenize project called Bike Train Bike, or BTB. But Michael, you're now with Access, and I just really want to give it to you if you'll give us your background and how you know about what's going, how you know about our region, because you've worked with on a couple of different programs here locally. So it's all yours, Michael. Take it away.
For sure. Well, thanks, Barry, and thanks for inviting me to chat today. And happy to talk about bikes and trains whenever I can, whenever I have the opportunity. So here we are. So as you alluded to, yeah, I recently actually just changed jobs. So I'm working 2 weeks in now, so still kind of fresh. At a consulting firm up here in Canada called Access Planning. We are broad multimodal transportation planners with a focus on strategy and high-level planning and governance and other very sort of important structural things to make public transit and multimodal transportation work in our cities. And so our focus, is really U.S. Canada. But I came from about 7 years of being the director of the small North American studio for Copenhagenize design company, originally based in Copenhagen with offices in Copenhagen, Paris, and my old office in Montreal here in Canada. And so, over the last number of years, like I had a great opportunity of being able to work with folks and planners and communities all across North America. And one of our latest projects in the last couple of years, which actually came on board right when COVID restrictions hit really hard, was working with the County of Santa Cruz and Ecology Action to develop the active transportation plan for the unincorporated regions of the county that I think most folks have probably seen by now, especially people in this space, or at least with an interest in this space. And so we were involved with the Ecology Action team, who was leading that, of doing a whole bunch of different analyses, helping and consulting work on a whole bunch of the what became virtual public engagement. We were supposed to be in town for that. And previously being in the region, how originally I met Barry actually was we were working with the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition in 2018, 2019 to develop an open source data network priority tool to sort of allow different cities in the region sort of equip themselves with a data tool to kind of fight back against maybe some of the misconceptions of where bike links could go or where they couldn't. So through essentially the tool used open source data and was built around a specific number of parameters that helped sort of like prioritize and justify why certain links were necessary in certain areas. So I'm not actually sure how the tool's being used these days, and I think things definitely changed with the pandemic and how a lot of different groups are organized. So hopefully that's still running over there. So that's about me. Did you want to chat about anything else, Barry, before we jump into the topic?
I don't think so, Michael, but I do just want to express how grateful we all were when we met in it had to be 2019 in December with Gina Kolb and Bob Arco. Gina being the director of Bike Santa Cruz County at the time, and Bob Arco being with Friends of the Rail and Trail, and the four of us talking about the potential here locally with the rail line and all the studies being conducted and the opportunities for some kind of rail service. And to just to set this up, locally we have a debate over whether to use a rail line or not, and there seems to be a number of people who think it should just be for bikes, and another group of people who thinks it should be for bikes and rail transit. And the reason your presentation is so important is to show the entire community what the possibilities are when you integrate the two. So I thank you for that, and I look forward to your. I've seen your slides. I gotta confess, I've seen the slides, so I'm very excited. So please take it away, and then we'll take questions and answers from those in attendance. And Gina's joined us. Hi, Gina.
Hi, Gina. We know each other.
Take it away, Michael. Thank you.
Thanks. So here, I'll share my screen. Just let me know if you can see everything. Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
So yeah, like Barry said, you know, my focus today was really to try to talk a little bit more high level and, you know, global and you know, national scan sort of thing on what can theoretically happen when we combine bikes and public transportation. How can we leverage, you know, better transportation choices by combining transportation modes in our cities? And so, you know, talking sort of more high level philosophical here to maybe, you know, be able to arm folks with some good ideas and some good precedent to sort of move forwards in the county. There we go. So we're going to kick off with kind of a preliminary question, and that's sort of the idea behind you know, the bike train concept is how do we leverage multiple different modes at the same time to improve one another and drive more travel away from the car, pun intended. So the idea is to combine the bike and the train, and we call it a door-to-door solution. And the reason is that the bicycle is the most efficient mode of transportation over short distances, and the train in this concept, in this context, although we could be talking about more broader public transportation, but the train here is really the most efficient form of transportation for long distances. So if we can combine these two to capture different types of journeys, we can really create a very efficient door-to-door solution. And the reason why this really is so efficient is because ultimately we know that, you know, when we're talking about a standard transit hub or transit station, most folks will be comfortable walking about 1 mile outwards, you know, so a 1 mile radius is what we're kind of showcasing in this image here. And we know that the average person would be willing to cycle you know, 2 to 3 miles. So we already know that the amount of space that could be covered cycling, and especially if we look at that on an aerial perspective, or rather than just on a linear perspective, we know that that could actually be 25 times larger if we also take into consideration e-bikes. So, you know, the average person might e-bike from you know, a single point destination like a transit station up to 5 miles comfortably. Some people more, some people less, with sort of a bit of the average that we see from some of the research. And so to know that we could create a catchment area of folks that will get to or from that high speed, you know, transit link, you know, so much broader, it really increases the opportunities for who might be able to use public transportation, and remove some of those barriers to entry for others. And so I wanted to like just quickly visualize what that looks like on a corridor, and you'll notice the shape sort of looks a little bit like a rail line you might all be talking about these days in a county such as yours. And you know, if we were to just sort of, you know, tentatively visualize what a 1 mile walk shed would look like, you know, from theoretical station points along a rail corridor, you can see, okay, you can get to certain places and you can get from certain places, but there's definitely gaps. Once we add in that bike shed, so we start to talk about a 3 mile cycle from each of those nodes, we start to find overlap. We start to find, you know, I'm losing my words. We're starting to find overlap ultimately from one shed bleeding into another. And this is a good thing. In a transit network, we want to have redundancy. Sorry, that was the word I was looking for. We start to see redundancy in being able to actually have overlapping networks, and even more so when we get into talking about e-bikes. So if we have these 5 mile bike sheds or e-bike sheds, you can ultimately access multiple different stations within you know, your standard e-bike distance. So the accessibility to and from so many stations becomes so much larger than what it would be in its initial formation of just stations that folks walk to or a park and ride. So for this combination to work, it has to also, be thought about in a more broad sense of which different trips might be replaced. So, in one sense on the top, we would have the standard car driver who would then, from home to work. And of course, there's many different types of trips, but just to sort of show this in a simplified form, there are folks that would theoretically go from car to public transportation. There are other folks that would move from maybe a feeder bus at the home leg of their journey, that normally they would be taking a bus to a rail link, but now the bike can offer a more efficient connection on one end of their journey, or vice versa. It could be on the far end of their journey. They rely on a bus that maybe doesn't come very frequently, or they're very used to missing it. It's only coming every 30 minutes. And if we can offer a bike connection on that last end of their journey, there's efficiencies that can really be caught and additional choices that can be given to users. If we do a little bit of a thought experiment, we say, okay, as an example, if we're thinking about a 2-mile trip to get to a train station, and we think about the different modes we can use to get to that station. Well, if we're going to take the local bus, it's going to cost us not an arm and a leg, but it's not nothing either. But it could be 10 minutes if there's traffic, or it's rerouted, or it's stuck somewhere. The bus could take 15 minutes or longer. Like sometimes this happens with certain bus routes that are relying on, the flow of traffic to get you from point A to point B. With a car, you never know, because you may be stuck in traffic yourself. And we know that this is the most expensive possible mode to get you from, that point, let's call it home, and then to the station. We know that walking is one of the cheapest. We know it doesn't cost very much at all to just put on your shoes and walk to the station, but ultimately it's going to take you the longest, about 45 minutes. And meanwhile, the bike sort of fits in that Venn diagram. It's the cheapest, and it's the quickest and most efficient and reliable, because even if there's traffic, you can generally get around it. The bicycle is pretty traffic proof, as we say. So with that in mind, it really is an efficient mode of transportation for those short distances to get to the station. So what I did for this presentation is I kind of group things into 2 sections, combo 1 and combo 2. And I want to look at sort of the 2 ways around the world that bikes and trains have been combined from kind of a programmatic and systemic perspective. And, we can obviously discuss afterwards, like what things do folks think work, what don't, what would make more sense in the Santa Cruz context, et cetera. I think it could, just elicit some interesting conversation afterwards. So combination 1, this is bike in train. So this is, or in public transit in general. So, this exists in many different forms. And I think the most standard form that we know of it, especially in the North American context, is the bike rack on a bus. And so this is a way of bringing your bike with you on a more rapid form of public transit. But we also know that this is one of the least accessible ways of getting a bike on a form of public transportation. A lot of folks struggle, myself included, and I'm a person that rides my bike every single day to get around my city. But even myself, I struggle to open and figure out how to use the contraption of these bike racks on the bus. They're really not super user friendly. And then on top of that, you have to be strong enough and confident enough to lift your bike and put it on there. I recently got myself a cargo bike. It won't even fit on there. So the barrier to entry is still quite high for a lot of folks. And if any of I can't see who else is in the chat today, if anybody else has joined, but any of you who are regular bike riders and you've wanted to bring your bike on public transportation, I'm sure there are certain worries and barriers that you all feel about that as well. So it's a pretty common understanding about bikes on buses. So if we look to other sorts of solutions, we kind of go up the sliding scale of what's happening and what's a bit more easy to use and comfortable. We have this is an example from Seattle on the left, and I can think of a couple other similar examples on local transportation, high-speed transportation, or regional rail in a whole bunch of North American cities. But it's the standard bike hook. And so you'll be able to, for a lot of people, it might work really well, especially if you're like this person with the light Cannondale racer, and then you're gonna just zip on in, you're gonna lift your bike up and you put it on the hook. But anybody with panniers, anybody with a heavy bike, anybody that's not physically able, or anybody that just doesn't want to have to haul up their bike and get grease on themselves, is really not going to be so necessarily enthralled with this idea. So again, a bit of a tricky barrier to entry, although it is a solution for some. When we go over to the right, this is actually an example photo that I took in Silicon Valley. I believe this was in Sunnyvale when I was in town when Barry and Gina and I met up in 2019. And I was actually really pleasantly surprised to see in the bus, I think it was in an articulated bus, these roll in and lock, not lock with a key, but I mean like locking your frame so it doesn't wiggle out and fall out, these bike racks on a bus. I actually hadn't seen them before. And if you see in the bottom, there's a little hydraulic lever as well. So I think it makes it a little bit easier to clamp down on the front wheel and kind of hold it tight while the bus rattles. So, probably not the easiest contraption to use, but definitely a lot more comfortable and accessible for folks than, the last two solutions. Again, if you have panniers, if you have racks, if you have an oddly shaped bike, which, as we're trying to get more and more people biking and opening up a diversity of users and a diversity of bicycle forms and shapes and types, this doesn't necessarily fill that need for a lot of people. So it still creates a certain barrier to entry. We keep moving towards more innovative and more useful opportunities. So on the far right here, you see this is in BART. So, it's just such a simple solution. These two little paddles that hold the front wheel. You don't have to take it up a ramp. You don't have to clamp it in. It doesn't take a manual to know how to use. And the example on the left, this is from a train in France. And, this example, it's kind of similar to that one that we saw on the bus in the last example from Santa Clara. But being on a train, it's a lot more stable. There's a lot more room inside. And this car was actually specifically designated for bikes, although it's not exactly the easiest contraption to use. So we see, that sliding scale of things getting, more and more conducive to comfortably putting your bike in transit and for many different types of users of different ages and abilities. Then we move even further, and this is in Berlin. This is the regional Bahn, the S-Bahn, and I think the intercity trains, some of them don't look all too different either. But you have these portions of cars with flex seating that can go up and use for bikes or strollers. You don't need a manual to use this. You really roll in and you sit next to your bike and you hold it, or you stand next to it. But there's just space that's available and comfortable and wide for you to just roll in and roll off. And you can see here, if you see my cursor, there's a big pictogram on the window to make it really clear, like this is the portion of the car that's for bikes, and it comes at various stages. So it's not all the way at the front or all the way at the end of the train. So it's more accessible that way. And then what I would say is sort of the creme de la creme, the top version of this first combo is really the Copenhagen S-Train model. And they really redefined, what it means to be able to comfortably bring your bike on transit, even to the point where you can see bringing cargo bikes is very comfortable. All the stations have level boarding. You can get onto the station and onto the platform from a network of bike infrastructure very comfortably, even if you have a heavy bullet bike like my colleague who's in the photo on the left, which I think I took this picture about 4 or 5 years ago in Copenhagen during one of our sessions. And then when you see on the inside, it's essentially an entire car dedicated to bikes. And it has that same sort of flex seating as what you see in Berlin, as well as those little paddles that hold the back or front wheel like you saw in the BART system. So it kind of uses a little bit of these different techniques that we've seen in a couple of different places. And also the big stickers, you can go back, you can see behind the guy over here, the big stickers that show the full bicycle car. And so it's really yielded some really great results for the greater Copenhagen region. Copenhagen as well is a city that its suburbs were all built along these transit-oriented corridors. They call it the five-finger plan of Copenhagen. So along these areas that look like fingers of a hand is really where the rail lines were first placed, and most of the development has happened. And so it's really conducive to having a train that is very dedicated to cyclists. And some of the stats from the Danish Cycling Embassy speak to that. So this is from a couple of years ago, I believe, but I'm sure it's somewhere in the realm of that today. But almost 30% of the people that actually cycle between their homes and the station that are using the train are out in the suburbs, and 10% of folks that are on the trains going to and from the suburbs and the central city cycle between the station and their destination within the city. I assume a lot of folks also walk because the central core of Copenhagen itself is not so large. So that's all the great stuff about this first combo, bikes on trains. But there are a lot of contexts where we know there's a lot of issues, and a lot of that has to do with capacity. And so this is just a couple of headlines that I took as screen grabs. On the left, an example from the SkyTrain in Vancouver. On the right, this is an example from the transit agency in Belgium, National Railway Company, SNCB. You know, and there's been constant musings in cities all around the world that, you know, what are we supposed to do, especially at peak hours when we need to have a certain capacity for users and a certain throughput on our transit, and, you know, having a ton of bikes in there, it's just not conducive to moving people more efficiently. So, you know, there's always going to be that issue of capacity versus bike storage when we talk about this first combination. But I think, you know, the examples that I can think of where it's really created a large issue, whether that's here in Belgium, in Vancouver, or here in my home city in Montreal, we do have you know, quite a lot of cyclists comparatively to a lot of other North American cities. And so, you know, I think there is definitely an argument of perhaps this first combination of bikes on trains can work for a certain period of time in certain contexts where maybe, you know, there aren't that many cyclists at the beginning on the local network. And so it's just a couple of bikes here and there. And then, you know, rules do have to change. Maybe eventually if it gets too busy, maybe there do need to be rules that say, you know, during peak hour when the trains need to be full, this needs to be organized. And then, you know, in the best case scenario, when our trains become very, very efficient and very, very quickly run and very well used, and we've got fantastic cycling, then we can go to the Danish model and we can say, okay, we're going to dedicate full cars in our suburban train to bikes alone. And then we'd see those positive results. So I think the outcome from this first combo, and I'd be curious to hear everybody else's thoughts about this and have a bit of a chat about it later, is that it's not necessarily a silver bullet. I think it has a lot of great outcomes of finding ways to allow bikes onto public transportation, to allow for folks to bike to the station and then from the station on their personal bike. There's a fluidity in that process for the user, but there's definitely some systemic and capacity issues that need to be sort of thought out in those specific systems. Okay. So now let's move on to combo number 2. And I'm sure folks here know that there is sometimes a little bit of an online battle between the Danes and the Dutch about who are more cycling friendly. And so funny enough, the combo 1 versus combo 2 take a Danish versus Dutch approach. So the combo 2, which I would argue, even though I've worked for a Danish company for the last 7 years, now I can say it, I'm out, no, I'm kidding, is the combo number 2 is really the Dutch approach. And the Dutch approach of bike opportunities on each end without necessarily bringing the bike on the train itself or on public transport itself. It requires a much larger systems thinking approach. But one could argue, and I'll try to show you in a couple of slides, that the Dutch approach really has shown the largest positive results of probably any model in the world. So let's get into it. So the concept from the Netherlands is really this big investment from the national railway system at the turn of the millennium. We're talking about an investment of 400 million euros to improve a multitude of different cycling services offered at train stations across the entire country of the Netherlands. If we jump down to the third line, we can see that basically more than 20,000 OV-fiets. OV-fiets is the name of the bike share system in the Netherlands. So 20,000 OV-fiets were placed at 300 stations, as well as bus and tram stops all across the country. And 500,000 bicycle parking spaces were offered across the country. So this was a massive investment, not in just one thing or another, but in this holistic bike facility and bike usability system across the entire railway system. And within the first 3 years, the National Railway itself saw a 20% increase in ridership overall. So I think what's really interesting, and we'll get more into some of these details, but what's really interesting about the Dutch approach is that increased connection and focus on bicycles and bicycle facilities by the railway operator actually allowed more railway use at the end of the day. So it became this symbiotic relationship. And over time, folks have found in the Netherlands that over 50% of the passengers that actually take trains across the country actually arrive at the station by bike. So it's not like this has had some small impact. Again, keeping in mind that the Netherlands is probably the most cycling friendly nation in the world, and every single medium-sized city and small town and large city has bike infrastructure and calm streets and good traffic planning everywhere. So it's already a very accessible place by bike. But the fact that that this investment since the early 2000s allowed for such a huge shift in how folks get to the train station is really, really amazing. So some of the concrete results that were seen over the years that came through a whole bunch of survey data, and like Barry alluded to before, a lot of the data in these slides, in these next couple of slides, come from a study that my colleague Clotilde, who runs our French office, or the Copenhagenize's French office in Paris, she had worked with a consortium of folks in 2015 to 2017 in a study called BTB, like Barry said, Bike Train Bike, that was funded by the EU Commission to look at essentially 4 cities and help run pilot projects to better connect bikes and trains through sort of one specific station or one specific piece of the network improvement, and track that over 3 years. So a lot of the Dutch focus was looked at as sort of the inspiration for how this model could be applied to other European cities. So their 4 partner cities that they worked with on that project were, if I remember correctly, Milan, Barcelona, Liverpool, which is not EU anymore, and what's the last one? I'm forgetting it. Oh, and Ghent in Belgium. So anyway, this is some of the data that came out of their study. So you can see here at the top, 8% of folks that were using the train had said they would have used their car if it were not for the bike share. So essentially 8%, that is not a small number of folks who were driving from home to work. And because there was a bike share on an existing train connection, suddenly the train was attractive to them because of that first mile, or could have been first multiple mile connection, wasn't efficient or logical enough for them. So they just took their car before. So that already is an amazing change we can see. On the bottom left, we can see 42% of train passengers said that they used a bike for their first mile to get to the train station. 54% of train users said they use the bike more often. We don't know to what degree, but that's still, more than half of people use the train more often because of the availability of a bike share system. And 46% of people said that on their last mile, they actually stopped using a tram or a bus route. Maybe it was inefficient and they didn't like waiting. And the bike was sort of the way for them to, the bike share, the OV feats, was the way for them to get to their last mile more efficiently. And so from this, the BTB project essentially built 5 steps or 5 main principles for how to effectively combine public transportation and bikes. And these were used as sort of the guiding principles in all 4 of the case study and pilot projects to look at if you were going to actually make a change, make a change in these 5 areas, and then we'll track the success over time. So I want to spend a little bit of time just going through the 5 principles, and we can dig into each of them a little more deeply. So I won't go over them right now. We'll go through one by one. So step number 1 is essentially having secure bicycle parking at your transportation facility. So right off the bat, I'm sure many people have seen some really terrible bike parking in their life. We know, a big problem is a lack of supply. So you can see here on the tree down below, people need to park somewhere and they find whatever they can. Sometimes we just have really badly designed and overly complex systems that don't work for a diversity of users and different frames and shapes of bicycles. So the top right is an example from Stockholm, which I always like to joke that it looks like you need an IKEA manual to use it because it's Swedish confusion over here. And then there's a whole bunch of other common bike parking mistakes. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. If it's insecure, it's unsafe. If it's difficult to access, people won't use it. There's so many different mistakes that are made. But when we are doing successful bike parking, we have to think about 3 things, and that is location, location, and location, just like in real estate. And the reason for this is that, like, if you're parking your car or you're walking somewhere, like, you have different trip types and different trip needs. And so those end of trip facilities need to be different for folks that are doing different sorts of things. At a regional train station where you may want to leave your bike for 24 to 48 hours, you need to have protected parking. You need to have maybe CCTV. You maybe need to have some sort of rest area if you've come in from a longer way to access the train. There's a bunch of things that are necessary for overnight parking that is not necessarily for a quick stop. That could be a simple rack anchored into the ground that you just need to have right in front of the station or right in front of the front door of your destination. Versus something that maybe you're willing to walk a little bit farther away because you know you're keeping the bike there for a little bit longer. So these typologies of parking are really important, and location really factors into all of them. And so we kind of have a sliding scale when we're thinking about the implementation of bicycle parking. On the bottom axis, this is meters, distance from sort of the front door of the entrance of your destination. And on the y-axis, we have time. So if you're doing a 5-minute quick stop, we're okay to have the bike parking up to about 5 meters away, but you really want it right at the front door. Because if you have to go bike and then park, way down the street, or like around the building to just run in and grab, a bottle of water or something. I hope you wouldn't be grabbing a bottle of water, but going in and grabbing a chocolate bar, then, at that point you need, for it to make it convenient for folks, it needs to be right in front of the front door. And like I said, if we go to the far end of the sliding scale, if you're leaving it there for 24 hours, then we have amenities on the sort of second y-axis. We want service options. It needs to be monitored, covered, theft-proof, all these things beyond just simple racks, which are sort of the bare minimum necessity for bike parking of all types. And when we talk about parking, I mean, it needs to be accessible. It can't just exist on an island in and of itself. So for a lot of transit stations, we often have level changes. So if you're going to have an escalator, you need to be able to make sure that it's wide enough that the bike can go with you and next to you, or an elevator option. Or if you have stairs, you need to have bike rails. I love this example on the top left. This is actually a building I lived in Copenhagen. It was just the most logical bicycle parking. You were right on the street entrance. You'd roll right up. You'd have your fob that would open the door for you. It would open automatically, and you'd roll right into the bike parking. It was right, and it was visible, so you knew, if you were a visitor, you knew where you could park right away. So accessibility for parking, whether it's at your home destination or at a transit station, is incredibly important. And then, of course, it's, there's standards that need to be followed, and these standards make sure that there's enough room for enough growth. And so, agencies and municipalities and regional governments need to think about growth in cycling and the growth they want to see, and adapt standards to expect for that growth, especially with seasonal peaks. And other sorts of amenities, whether that is lockers, showers, changing rooms. It's different in different contexts, but these things need to be thought through. And then, of course, this was alluded to before, but the right racks are important. So, on the schematic diagram on the right, you can see there's kind of 4 different types of racks. So, a lot of folks, a lot of bike parking that's implemented, especially a lot of private developers, love to put in these hanging racks. Actually, as we saw before, agencies also like to do it on transit. It takes up very little space and they're very cheap. So it's great from the agency's perspective, but from the user's perspective, if you're not bodily abled, if you don't have a light sports bike, if you have panniers or anything that is irregular for a lot of other bikes, especially as we know them in North America, they just don't work. They're just not conducive to parking. So having double stack racks, or having wide U racks, or even lower wide racks for cargo bikes, we need to think about all the different types of users that need bike parking. And finally, safe and security. So we need to make sure that safety is not just about how heavy duty the rack itself is, but it's also about lighting. It's about sight lines. This example on the right is Nørreport Station, a big interchange station in the heart of Copenhagen. And what's wonderful with the design of this station is you have a sea of bicycle parking outdoors, but the architect actually won a whole bunch of awards for sinking it all down. So all the bike parking is sunk down maybe 2 feet on this gentle grade. It's almost like a little lake, but the water can actually drain down there. They built in drainage as well, so that when you actually look over the sea of bike parking, you can actually see your friend on the other side. So if you're inside the bike parking area, you don't, at night, feel like you're between 2 walls and you might get, assaulted. So this idea of eyes on the street for good urbanism is also important for bike parking design. And Maintenance. Always important for any type of transit facility that we're ever implementing. There always has to be a budget for operations and maintenance, and that applies to bicycle facilities as well. And often at big parking facilities at transit agencies or transit stops, we will see bikes often abandoned. And so it has to be the municipality, the agency, that makes sure that over time, those facilities are monitored. They are, capacity isn't restricted because of too many old, rusted, or broken bikes just sort of being left there for a long time. But also innovative approaches can be used. So in the bottom right, this is an example from Copenhagen that the city implemented called the Bicycle Butlers. And instead of the police just coming and taking away bikes that were rusted, they would spruce it up. They would oil your chain. Maybe they would dust off the bike or do a little fix if they noticed it, and put a little tag saying, we fixed up your bike, it's ready to ride. Please don't leave it here for more than 24, 48 hours. And then if somebody didn't respond after, a certain amount of time, they would then impound it. So just things to think about. And some of these examples that come together with all of these thoughts well executed, we see Copenhagen Central Station in Denmark, where we see thousands of parking spaces. We see many different types of bike parking. It's probably not the best picture because you only see big clutter. This is one sort of I'd say medium-term bike parking area, whereas there are more covered, long-term bike parking areas that are not exterior. Some are free, some are paid. There's a diversity of racks for a diversity of users who might want to then get to the train station and hop on an intercity train. Same thing in Belgium, the Ghent station. This is an example of their interior area, and just tons of opportunity and simple racks that are low down to the ground, wide enough so many different types of bike users can go and access them. And then the creme de la creme, probably the nicest bike parking station ever built in the world, just opened a couple of years ago in Utrecht in the Netherlands. And this is just an absolutely incredible station. I actually haven't had the chance to visit it myself, but I'd like to. A colleague of mine just told me the other day, the problem is it's actually too big. You almost get lost in it, but it has 33,000 bicycle parking spots on multiple levels. It's brand new facility designed like a gorgeous car garage, which I don't know if car garages ever really are gorgeous, with ramps that take you in and different amenities and cafes. And it's just a wonderful place, but obviously way out of the scope of what we're sort of capable of in this decade in North America, I'd say. So if we think about it on the slightly smaller scale, we do have some examples. This is one of the examples of the BTB project in the greater Milan area, where essentially a small car parking lot of 10 car parking spots on a suburban rail line was converted as a pilot project to a protected, as you can see, corrugated metal, cheaply built facility, but safe and card activated through the transit agency for 90 bicycles. So you think about just a 9-fold increase in capacity rather than just 10 car parking spots that who knows how well they were even used. And then it comes with a whole bunch of great amenities like lockers and other things. And an example a little closer to home, to be honest, there's very few examples of a network-wide series of bike parking facilities in North American transit system, which is quite sad, but it means we can only go up from here. But I think the most comprehensive example we have is in Vancouver. So TransLink, the transit agency in Vancouver here in Canada, has built this network and is continuing to implement this network of bike parkades, as they call them. And as you can see on the right, the size and scale, it's similar to the Como example. We're talking about maybe 80 to 100 bikes. This is a facility that's essentially at a metro or their SkyTrain, so it's like a metro light rail station, and they're all over the city, and they're right at the station. You can access it with it's called your Compass card. It's their transit card there, and then as long as you're signed up as a Compass member, you can go and have safe, protected, station integrated exchange to leave your bike and then get on the SkyTrain to get somewhere else around town. So it's really starting to happen in North America, and TransLink's a really amazing agency to look at to see how they're sort of leading the charge, and hopefully we start to see more examples like this across North America. So that's the first of the 5 steps. I promise the other ones are going to be a little bit shorter. But bike parking is so important, because if you can't get that right at the station, it's really hard to have to properly do this sort of combination of bike and train. So the second is the question of the integrated bike share. And the question of integration is different in different contexts. But ultimately, to try to showcase what this means in terms of integration is in the top example with the little quizzical, not so sure emoji. Here, the example is I'm leaving my house and I'm taking my nice, cool, brand new pink racer. And, it's my bike. I know how to use it and I get efficiently to the station. And there's great parking facility. That first piece has been done. I get on the train, I get into town, and then I get into town where I want to go. And I know, oh, there's like these new Lime bikes and they're bright green. They're cool. Okay, I have the app and I have to figure it out, but I get it and I get to my destination. So it's not a bad journey. You have used bike, train, and bike, and it has worked for you. But you essentially have to use 3 different systems. You have to be like knowledgeable about the systems. You have to be comfortable leaving your bike behind. You have to know where to find the new bike on the other end. So the barrier to entry is still quite a bit higher than a system that will just become easy to use for the vast majority of people. So that's where the integration of the bike into the network of public transit becomes really important. And that's what this example down below is seeking to show. And we can talk through what that looks like. So the best case scenario is the Dutch example when we're talking about an integrated bike share, and that is the OV Fiets I mentioned. So the bottom left, that is the OV Fiets bike. It is one style of bike with one color palette, which is the same color palette as the transit agency because it is owned by the transit agency. So of course, the integration is just evident and obvious there. The one style of bike is the Oma Fiets, the grandma bike. It's this step-through frame that is heavy, that is easy for anybody wearing pants or a dress or anything to access. And it's a very comfortable ride, upright. You're not going to sweat. You're not going to be, in this sporty position. You can put some luggage on the back rack if you need to. So it's just a really good, simple bicycle for everyone to use. And the price of using that is integrated into your fare. So you're buying your train ticket and you also have access to the OV Fiets at the beginning and at the end. So that entirely integrated system is the absolute ideal of what could be achieved, and it works really well in the Netherlands. In Belgium, the national rail operator has been launching Blue Bike, and it's their attempt to kind of copy the Dutch example. And it's more in its infancy, but they're really finding some great results as well. But as we know, in North America, it's very hard to find a transit agency that also happens to own and operate a bike share. It doesn't exist quite in the same way. So if we cannot have the ideal of the number 2 of the integrated bike share, then we need to have at least an integrated fare. And honestly, I would be very interested to hear if any of you know of any other examples, but the only 2 examples I've been able to think about and talk with my colleagues about of a bike share system that's actually owned by a transit operator in North America is LA Metro. So the photo that you see over here, and Quebec City up here in Canada, which is a brand new system that I don't think most people in California have ever heard of because it literally just launched this year. And Quebec City is one of our smaller cities as well in Canada. That's this Avelo system on the right. That's also the transit agency who's launched that. But most other places don't have, in North America, don't have that same, National Railway OV Fiets style model, which would be the ideal. So when we don't have that fully integrated bike share, how can we try to integrate the fare a little bit better, even if the fare isn't integrated? And we can look to some models, like this is an example from Montreal, where you have the Opus card, which is your transit card for all of our metro and our suburban rail and bus system. And then we have our Bixi, which is our bike share system. So you can see the 2 in the photo on the left. But at the same time, if you use your Opus card, you can get a Bixi, but it's going to cost you twice. So you essentially have to buy a ride and a train ticket. So you're paying twice to use the same system. So because it's 2 different entities and they're not willing to merge their organizational and governance structures because that is highly complex, and I would love for them to, but I don't think it's happening anytime soon. On the bottom right, you can see this is a screenshot from their website where they do offer combined passes. So you get discounts and they make sure that it is as seamless as possible, especially for folks that are buying monthly passes or yearly passes, so that you're not then paying double. You're probably paying a little more than you would to have the bike and the rail and the bus all on your pass, but you can still use that one pass for all of those different facilities. So it still is a way of integrating a system that is not fully integrated from the outset. The fourth element is a fairly simple one, but one even more lacking than an integrated bike share across North America, and that is positive and proactive communications. The number of situations I've seen where transit agencies and cities just forget about communicating positively and proactively about what they're doing and how they want folks to act, and do it in a way that, you know, brands and products do, which actually attracts people to those services or products. So this is an example from here in Montreal where it says a cocktail for transport that will take you far, translated from French, which is bike, metro, and bus. One example on the bottom right, this is a screenshot from a video in TransLink in Vancouver, where they just started a new campaign called Let's Ride, and it's showing how folks will ride in to transit stations to then go from bike to train. And they're really taking control of that communication positively and proactively. And then this on the left is again from the BTB project, where we had kind of done a number of examples of, you know, how can we showcase, how can we incentivize and sort of make it seem really sexy and attractive to gain time, reduce your cost, you know, have this applicable for a diversity of user profiles and unlock freedom and ease of use. So really selling these concepts once a system has some merit in place. And then finally, our fifth step in finding success in combining things in this second combination form is having bicycle infrastructure in our local communities that actually connect directly to each station. If we have gaps in our network, especially right by the station, of course, it's another gap, another barrier to entry. So really having that protected bike infrastructure that takes us right up to the station is super key. So I'm going to end on this slide, and it's just, I wanted to share this with you all before we just have a little chat. And ultimately, this is the takeaway from the 4 pilot projects I had mentioned in the BTB project. So in Liverpool, in Ghent, in Milan and Barcelona. And so sort of summarized all together, the project put together this little page to show that overall, there were some amazing successes that were found. So if we start at the top, we can actually see that based on this is all based on survey data for folks that participated and were users in the various different transit agencies in those 4 cities. But essentially, with a BTB system, with those 5 steps implemented in each of these 4 cities, there were 5 to 10% of people that used the secure bike parking that were drivers before, that used to drive all the way into the city. And 15 to 20% of the people of the secure bike parking facilities at the home end, they used to take their car to the train. So already eliminated 15 to 20% at one side and 5 to 10% of drivers on the other side. So huge elimination of drivers for folks that are then using the train and using the bike because of that integrated option. And then the same thing on the sort of last mile side. So 20% of folks that used to drive the entire way into the city, they actually said they stopped doing that because of the bike share. And the bike share is really for them what made the difference. And same thing on the train to final destination side, 5% of people stopped driving and started using the bike share scheme. And even more amazing results at the bottom. On the bottom left, we saw that more cyclists basically came into the network because the bike was integrated with the train rather than just bike networks on their own. So this is a really good indication of how people feel about when we build facilities that are bike and train and not just bike or just train. Good for your context. So here we knew that actually 40 to 50% of bike parking users were actually new cyclists. They hadn't ridden their bike before, and now it made sense for them because it made that first part of their journey to the train a lot more efficient and a lot more pleasant, I'm sure too, because riding a bike is fun. And on the far end, this was really one of the most amazing stats. 70% of the people that use the bike share system to get from the train to their final destination were new cyclists. So we know that from a lot of examples all across, especially North America, bike share can be that really amazing first catalyst to really get people cycling that weren't cycling before. And I think if you can leverage that with a connection with public transportation, you can see even better results. And then finally, in terms of the train passengers, we know that at the safe parking facilities at the home end, 20% of those people were new train passengers. So not only new cyclists, but also new train passengers. And 30 to 40% of the people that use the bike share said that they were also new train passengers. So we're talking about when we build an integrated system, we get cars off the road, we get bikes onto the street, and we get more bums in our transit facilities. So win, win, and win, as I see it. And let's have a chat. and maybe I'll stop sharing for now. And then I can go back to any slides if any folks wanted to ask questions about specific things I put up.
Well, I'll tell you, Michael, I just want to thank you for covering these things. And I know we have five of our attendees are friends of mine and champions in their own right. Probably all of them have been out with one effort or another, whether it be signs or dropping off leaflets or engaged in the conversation around a particular ballot initiative here locally to remove the rail line in favor of a trail. And I dare say most of the people who are aware of the possibilities are opposed to that idea because of exactly what you've described to us. I would love to hear some questions from anyone who's in the meeting. We have Gina and probably Margie or John Biddick, Mark, Paula, and Ron. And we have some comments and some questions in chat.
Barry, can we have anybody pop their videos on for asking questions, or is this is not the format?
I'd be happy to unmute them if I'd be happy to let anyone who would like to. Some folks are using older versions of Zoom, and that could be a problem. I'd love to hear folks' voices though. So raise a hand, and or I'm checking here. I'm allowing John or John or Margie to speak. Mark Johannesson, you are permitted to speak. There's John and Margie. Yeah, is that Margie?
Oh, I was just asking John if he had any questions.
I'm giving Paula and Rana permission.
Oh, I think Ron has his hand up.
Oh, Ron, go ahead, Ron. If you'll unmute.
Any better?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you speak a little bit about the bicycle superhighway and Copenhagen?
Sure. What aspect about it?
Well, I've seen it. I'd like to hear your description of it for the others.
Sure. Well, I guess in a nutshell, to explain the concept and also the execution of it, the Supercykelstier in Danish is the supercycle highway network that was really in its, I'd say, infancy in the last 10 years, but has really expanded very impressively, quite quickly. I don't have the data in front of me how many miles or kilometers have been developed recently, but quite a number of links out to the suburbs along the five-finger plan layout of Copenhagen. But Copenhagen was taking a bit of a back seat to the intercity and regional bicycle connectivity that the Netherlands had already been doing for many years, and they really started to pick up the pace. So some of the early routes on the supercycle highway, they weren't necessarily of the highest quality standard. Sometimes you would have to take a small town road with wayfinding that would then take you to an off-street path that was relatively narrow, and then eventually you got onto a really nice path in the city on the side of a major road, nice and protected. But over time, they've really been adapting the standards. So now, as far as I know, every single major and I'll be able to reinforce my knowledge on this because I'm going back to Copenhagen in 2 weeks, and I haven't been since before the pandemic, and I've heard a number of things have changed since. But I believe along each of the major routes, train routes emanating out from the core, those supercycle highway routes have been mostly completed, and now they're working on a lot of the radial connections to have a network connection between the suburban regions in Copenhagen. But on some of the newer facilities, I was able to ride a few of them in the last 3 or 4 years. You really have these fantastic, completely grade separated bicycle connectors that sometimes you're going through, the woods or underneath a highway through a really nice, underpass that has interactive lighting and it's quite comfortable, even though it's an underpass of a highway. The Dutch do that very well as well. And you have services along the way, air pumps, very good wayfinding, and you start to see more and more folks riding into town on e-bikes because the connector will be twice as long as what most people would ride normally on their bike, but with the e-bike, then it really lowers that barrier to entry. So the Supercycle Highway Network is something really exciting to keep watching in Copenhagen to see how it develops, because like I said, it's an amazing network, but it's still quite a few steps behind a number of the Dutch connections. And but I think it's growing really fast, and it's the latest data that I'd seen on it, the use numbers were just skyrocketing. They were really able to convince more people from the suburbs to use their bike than ever before. And then of course it has great impact on people that want to take their bike on the S-Tog, on the S-Train, and then get off at a suburban stop, and then maybe continue their journey further afield using the Supercycle Highway. And I assume once those radial lines are completed as well, that'll have even more positive impact for the train too. Anything else, Ron, you wanted to talk specifically about that?
Well, I just sent you an invitation to buy the first beer in Copenhagen. I'm leaving here, as John and Margie know, June 2nd, and I will be in Mark until the 15th of August. Okay, so
you're there the whole summer?
Yeah, 2.5 months.
Oh, great. Well, I'm actually there on the 4th. I'll be there from the 4th to the 11th. So get my email from Barry and shoot me a line.
All right.
I want pictures if you guys meet up.
All right.
I've got Mark Johannesson has his hand up. Mark, you should be able to talk. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Having lived in Amsterdam for a number of years, I mostly traveled on the trams. And you probably know the Dutch bicycles typically are these larger cruiser type bicycles. Mm-hmm. I didn't really see them that often on trams. The trams are really for people. So in the situation in Santa Cruz, likely whatever would go on the tracks would be something smaller like a tram. Mm-hmm. And so there's always going to be the competing interests, as you mentioned, of space for passengers versus space, for bicyclists. And are there good strategies to introduce bicycles and not discourage passengers, or vice versa?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think, I don't know if I would say we can do a one-to-one comparison of saying, a tram in Amsterdam versus a tram like a tram type a rolling stock that might be implemented if all goes well in Santa Cruz is the same tram, because ultimately the goal in connectivity is quite different. I mean, the distance that you'd be theoretically riding to get from Watsonville to central Santa Cruz, is going to be different than riding through some of the really dense core of Amsterdam, when also there's bike infrastructure all around you as well. So I think there is an argument to be made that there would be some, this is just my personal opinion, I'm sure other people feel otherwise, but I think there would be some utility to make sure that at least some space is made available to be able to have a bike on board. I think the Berlin solution, the one with the flex seating, is one that really allows for diversity of uses and a flexibility of times and types of use. So without building in something like I like the photograph from Santa Clara County, where you really saw these really big clunky bike holders that you clamped into with the hydraulic arm that can't be used for anything else and really does kill your capacity. And I can imagine if the bus is packed and people have to cram around that standing and there's no bikes, it's probably quite uncomfortable. You probably get some grease on your pants too. So I would really strongly suggest looking at that Berlin style model, which it's not just in Berlin, you see that all over the place, to have that flex space to allow for standing when you're at a peak time, but somebody to be able to also stand there with their bicycle when it's not quite as busy. But I think that comes down to more of the policy of once you have a transit line, then what is the policy for bikes on board and when?
Thank you.
No worries.
I have a question for you, Michael, and we hear from when we're having discussions with others who may either be opposed to the use of the rail line or on the fence. A common argument is that we don't have the density, or we're not Amsterdam, or and you may have heard this yourself. And I just wonder if you can think of, and the other thing is that the 3-year studies in those 4 European Union cities is remarkable, because you have a baseline and then a after treatment kind of numbers to go with. But my question is, can you think of some? Can you name some cities in North America that aren't metropolises that have a really good, I guess, BTB kind of relationship between the cycling community and the transit community, or even if they're not tiny communities, but...
No, for sure. I do always, I hesitate a little bit to just give a city example and say, oh, it works there, thus it's going to work here. I think you're right in the sense that we could find examples that are not giant cities that have slightly lower density, and yet the transit and the bike infrastructure and that integration has still been justified. So I think those can be used. But again, I just want to that's my preface. With that in mind, it actually came to mind immediately, the very unsexy city here in Canada of Ottawa, which is our capital. It's a city very rarely talked about internationally. It's a city of about 1 million, but it's very sprawling, and there's there is essentially a lot of suburban regions extending. It's along the Ottawa River, so actually, like Santa Cruz, there's a body of water on one end, and so they built out the first 2 lines of their light rail system in the last 10 years, where they really had nothing before, and the bike infrastructure network has been growing very impressively. And actually, one of the times I did a similar presentation like this, when I had that slide about integrating your bike infrastructure right at your transit node, I pulled a picture from Ottawa, because they've built this multi-use path network, which is not too unlike portions of your trail corridor that you're building along the old rail corridor, that flank their rail. And they've been able to start more and more building out that interconnectivity, and the numbers keep going up. So I think with that, and going back to what I said as kind of a preface, when people use the density argument, I think it's just so easy, right? It's such an easy argument to say, oh, well, it's a low density place, thus cars are king. Meanwhile, well, cars are king because all the infrastructure only allows cars to move around. There is no other option. So how can you say it only works for cars because of density? I think it's important to recognize that transit is a density generating tool. Transit and land use go hand in hand. Transit-oriented communities, land values do go up around transit. This is not, some unknown phenomenon from a corner of the world. And at the end of the day, every community has folks who don't want to sit stuck in traffic and only having to drive, want to save money or can't afford a car and need other public transit measures, and maybe just want other options and choices. So I think all of those arguments really play in, and then you can find the Ottawas and the other similar sort of North American, not hyper dense communities who've done it.
That's helpful. And Ottawa doesn't have, I'm guessing, quite as Mediterranean a climate as we might.
Oh no, one of the snowiest Canadian cities, yeah.
And yet they have that in a sprawling community, but has a great. So I'm going to look into that. I thank you for that.
And they justify it when, the same thing here in Montreal. The argument from a lot of detractors is, oh, well, why would we build a bike network because it's only used half of the year? Meanwhile, it's not true, and winter cycling is increasing. Yes, the numbers drop about tenfold, like you have about 1 to 10 in terms of ridership in the winter, but that's still slowly going up to 2 in 10 and 3 in 10 with infrastructure maintenance, with wider paths, with new technologies, with different tires. You know, all this stuff is slowly changing. But if that can work in a place where people say that cyclists only exist half the year, a place like Santa Cruz, you can cycle all year.
Thank you. And you know, one thing another kind of a counterpoint to the density thing is, first of all, we do have significant density comparable to Portland when you look at the cities of Santa Cruz and Watsonville. And the other counterpoint is that 100 years ago we had streetcars and we had bikes, and we didn't have, you know, when we had 1/10 of the population, we had a lot of people using bikes because we weren't so dependent.
And look at the suburbs, the streetcar suburb, and this is like early examples of TOD. Like development was created because of those tram lines, and then we ripped it out and we put everything in asphalt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Great. I have Paula recommending a couple of books. Maybe you can speak to them. She titled "The Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality," and Copenhagenize, the definitive guide to global bicycle urbanism.
I'm not unbiased to talk about that one, especially because I was a ghostwriter for some of the chapters. So.
I'm not surprised. And do we have another? Ron makes a recommendation, and you know, I don't know if you I think I mentioned to you, Michael, that since we had dinner in Los Gatos, we were able to bring, and Mark Johannesson was instrumental, and he brought the idea, in fact, to us. We brought a hydrogen powered battery electric streetcar to serve 3 days in Watsonville and 4 days operating between Capitola and Santa Cruz, with hourly service that people were able to experience riding. And so Ron Sandage adds in chat, I propose that in order to stimulate ridership on the Coast Futura, which is what we called the service. For the first year, the fare should be free, and then 50 cents for the next year, $1 for the third year, and $2 after that. I'm all for it. I'm all for free transit. Just keep it free. And you know, I can turn this into a question that you can expand upon, because you mentioned governance and funding a little bit. I think you ended you mentioned that funding is encouraged when a systematic approach is taken to the bike and the transit models, and you know, along with the resultant improvements in greenhouse gas productions, etc. So what do you have to say about transit costs, stimulating ridership, this kind of thing, when you have and you've dealt with cities around the world, so you might have some notions about how nations other than America might address transit funding.
Well, I mean, I just have to preface it by saying for the last, you know, many years, I've been a bike planner, and I've dipped my toe in the transit world beyond the bike train intermodality aspect. So I'm really not the person to speak to, you know, the wealth of knowledge about fare integration and you know, payment structures and governance structures around funding. I can definitely refer you to some of my colleagues at my new firm who are very, very well versed, even doing some work up in the Bay Area. But I mean, you know, my own personal 2 cents and what I've read here and there is that I don't necessarily believe that free ridership is the panacea that people think it is. I think having good facilities, having frequent headways, having good connections that are easy, accessible, comfortable, and not exorbitantly expensive. And of course, having a certain pricing model that also, you know, keeps in mind equity for folks that maybe can't afford what is standard for many others. I think that will also drive a system that will also have, you know, extra money in the coffers to continue to innovate and expand the system. So I think the idea behind free ridership is interesting because it seems like an incentive, but I don't personally know if it really does incentivize more than just building good transit and building good facilities.
Sure. Yeah.
But I see we got a bunch of hands up.
We do, and I'm just going to take. I'll take. Paula has a hand up, and can you do you want to speak, Paul? I'd love to hear everybody's voices where they're able to.
Yeah, I can speak. I just put a question for our speaker in the chat specifically because I'll be going to Amsterdam on June 16th, and I'm planning on riding around looking at bike infrastructure the few days that I'm there. And then, so if you have any comments on that, it could be offline. So just tell me how we can communicate. And then the one thing I wanted to say about reading the books that I recommended, that was, I think, an important thing to note is that the reason that Copenhagen and Netherlands became such incredible bicycle infrastructure places is because of money. And correct me if I'm wrong, that they couldn't afford to rebuild the vehicle infrastructure after the war, and bicycle infrastructure was cheaper. So I just wanted to say, so many times in our cities and jurisdictions, we hear, you know, them whine and complain that, you know, there's no money for bicycle infrastructure. So any comments on that?
Well, Paula, the one thing I will say to that is the Danish and the Dutch sort of rethinking of road design and planning, it was actually less of an outcome of the war and more of the oil crisis of the 70s, which is even more topical for today. I mean, you know, we're seeing, you know, oil prices rise right now. And, you know, everything I seem to read seems to show that we're not going to see it go down anytime soon. It seems like we are getting to, I don't know if we're going to, you know, it's not an OPEC crisis like it was in the 70s, but we're getting to some sort of a point where investment in oil is not going to be what it was in the past, and it's just going to continue to get expensive. Thus, the justifications for building cheaper infrastructure that is more sustainable and non-oil based, I think is the arguments are as stronger as they ever were. So the same arguments that folks in Denmark and the Netherlands use, I think we need to be the people that push those same arguments now, and the time is ripe. You know, that also came with a lot of mass mobilization and a lot of protest, and they did things like die-ins and other sorts of, you know, civil disobedience. Not that I'm advocating for it, but it worked in certain contexts in the past. Yeah.
And also some of the safety issues, there were some pretty horrendous, you know, roadkill, children and such, and that really fired people up. And we have that every day around here, it seems like. Yeah.
In North America, many parts of the world, we just seem to have just accepted that people die because of car fatalities, and that's just the way of life. And it's pretty sad. It's a pretty sad state.
Yeah. I have John and Margie Biddick have a hand up. Take it away.
Hi, Barry.
Hi, Margie.
Thank you, Michael and Barry, for this presentation. I really have appreciated the data that you presented, particularly the increase in train ridership once it was, you know, offered. Barry has already asked a couple of us, you've touched on some of the questions that I had, but one of them, in talking to the opposition, what we hear from them is that we don't have the population or density. You've already averted to that. And the other is that the cost is too high. You've touched on that just a bit. But my third question is, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about cities that have also incorporated like metro, what I called metro. I mentioned the word metro to a Danish woman that I met the other day, and she said she was confused by the term, but anyway, buses, you know. So if you could talk about that, or if you had any other ideas about how to respond to the cost is too high.
I'm not fully following the question, Margie. It's
okay, I'm sorry.
Because you're saying metro in terms of buses?
Yes.
Okay.
And how if there are any communities where, in addition to bicycles and train transit, there's also been the incorporation of, you know, a bus system in the area that's established.
I mean, there's countless examples of successful bus systems that have been integrated, but I again, I don't think I'm really necessarily the person to speak to that with a really detailed background in bus transit and transportation planning. I mean, Vancouver has been a city that's been like implemented a really interesting rapid bus system that's sort of, you know, modeled after BRT, but is more curbside rather than center running. But yeah, I don't know if I'm the right person to speak to some bus innovations. I'm not the most knowledgeable on the bus side of things for sure.
Okay.
I might at the risk of being wrong, I might try to restate Margie's question, or just say what it is I hear often enough that has to do with this. We can't afford it question, which is people say this without understanding, for example, that well, the criticism that is sometimes lodged against rail transit or transit generally is that it doesn't pay for itself. And as you know, fare box recovery varies from line to line and system to system, but it's almost never 100%. It's not a business. It's a public benefit program, and it requires subsidies. But then we know that roads also don't pay for themselves, and airlines and airports don't pay for them. Everything is subsidized in one manner or another. Have you? And I know that your job isn't always to be necessarily responding to arguments like this, but do you have anything to say about that? Anything helpful to say when we talk to somebody who says, well, it's too expensive?
Well, I think, Barry, you hit the nail on the head in sort of reframing the question and kind of answering it too, in the sense that I think the double standard is what's at play. It's where you have somebody saying, why should we fund a transit system? Nobody takes transit. And you say, well, there's no network for people to use, thus it's not used. Same argument, bike infrastructure. Why should we fund bike infrastructure? Nobody bikes. You know, it would be the same thing of saying you have two cliffs without a bridge and saying, why is nobody driving from cliff A to cliff B? Well, because they can't. I mean, it's this double standard that, you know, I get the same way that think about the number of bicycle or transit projects that require every citizen to be involved in a deep public consultation situation, which ends up becoming NIMBY after NIMBY just kiboshing the project. But when a new roadway is built or a new street is extended, there isn't a single public consultation because the assumption is that cars and roads are just how we move.
Yeah.
But if we're saying, if we are at peak oil, if we're at a place where we cannot be solely reliable on cars for transportation, we have to invest in other systems so that people get around in other ways, or at least have the choices to. So, you know, if that means a better bus system because we have a certain amount of roadway that we can use now, and then we can invest in rail to replace some of that bus, and then allow that bus to free up other, you know, to create larger catchment areas that connect to that rail, et cetera, then that's creating real transit options for folks that didn't have it before. Yeah.
Well, thank you. You know, and it's here locally, and it may be common in other communities that are looking to institute any new system when there's already a system but here it's very specific. They say it's been a successful, I think, false dilemma that rail's going to take money away from the metro or compete. And the studies that have been conducted have said quite the opposite, that by using state rail funding to pay for additional transit routes, we can expand in the network and more than double the number of transit riders across both combined systems. But and we're going to be talking about that at our 4 o'clock presentation. But I think in your case, the other false dilemma that we have before us locally is we can't have the superb premium bus, you know, world-class trail that we want with multiple lanes for different types of speeds and users if we have those stupid tracks there too. And what again I love about the BTB model and your presentation, whether it's in Ottawa or Milan or Santa Cruz, that the two modes together are additive, and that the sum of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, kind of thing.
Barry, if I can ask a clarifying question, does somebody here know sort of what in the model that's being proposed for the rail with the trail, what is sort of the standard width of the trail that's being proposed in that model?
12 to 16 feet typically, with just a couple of tight areas that might be a bridge crossing or something.
So I mean, ultimately, if you're coming up against this argument of world-class facility from a width perspective, I mean, look at the Netherlands, look at Denmark, look at the supercycle highways. They're not much wider than 14 to 16 feet. I mean, you don't need more space than that to transport people on micromobility if it's fully separated and protected, even grade separated at intersections or protected intersections. I mean, it's really those point areas that are more problematic. It's not the issue of we don't get 26 feet, thus nobody's going to bike. It's just completely false. You look at the world leading facilities in the Netherlands and Denmark, they're not that wide. They're wide, but they're not that wide.
Right. Thank you. That I think is the answer that we needed to hear. And the argument I've always made, and others, is that while a slightly wider trail is nice, it's not worth losing forever a transit. I mean, a rail transit that can serve all weather, all users, and cyclists as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think one other argument to bring forward, and I'll just say this quickly because I see Ron has his hand up as well, but is really like the conversation has to get away from cyclist versus transit user versus motorist. It's like putting people in different boxes. Like, I am a multimodal citizen. I'm Michael. I drive a car sometimes. I ride my bike. I take the train. I do it all. I want choice. I want options. And that's what's best for people. And that's really what transportation freedom means. It's not being stuck in a metal box behind hundreds of other people in metal boxes and we're all stalling and polluting. It means if I don't want to drive, I can take another mode. If I want to drive, then I can drive too. Fine. But
that's a beautiful final word. Thanks so much, Michael. We're really grateful, and we hope to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and nice to chat with everyone.
Thank you, Michael.
Take care. Have a good day.